if 29 nations agree, and the 29 nations by treaty under the UN, that there's chaos in a country, they don't need permission from the existing government, they can roll their troops into that area and create martial law situation and take whatever military action they deem necessary. I believe that what the Democrats are headed towards here, what the deep state will do, since they can't win politically, this is what they're going to invoke.
Of the Sharpening Report. I'm your host, Sam Johnson. We are found on YouTube, iTunes, Blog Talk. You can find me on Twitter at Sam T. Johnston. Well, as always, the news cycle is continually moving, and it seems like it's going at a faster pace than it ever has before. Whether it be about the immigration problems that we're having, aka the effort to remove the borders, or whether it be about the mainstream media and what they're trying to do, also known as censorship and moving the over to the window. We have to be very aware of what's going on, and more importantly, what the end goals are for the elites in charge. And joining us today is the host of the Common Sense Show, Dave Hodges. He is always on the front lines of trying to figure out what is going on, and he joins us today to talk about a number of very interesting topics. So, Mr. Hodges, how are you doing today?
I'm good. Thanks for having me on, Samuel.
Oh, it is a pleasure to have you on. So before we get into all of these very interesting topics, can we have a little bit of background on who you are, where you come from, and what got you into the YouTube world of breaking news?
Well, I've never thought I would ever do media work. I was forced into it. I'm an educator, a college basketball coach by trade. And John McCain and his globalist forces attempted to steal my land and that of 300 of my neighbors, and I made the mistake of speaking up at a public meeting one time, and I got to be the spokesperson in an 8-year battle, and that ended up culminating me having my first radio show after being in the media quite a bit. So I've just kind of happened into this, and as I was on my journey of trying to rescue my property rights, I discovered that things were bad, really bad, and I couldn't walk away from it. So now I do this pretty much full time. So I'm glad to be doing it. It's frustrating work. I think my life was more manageable when I wasn't doing it. Originally, I grew up in Colorado. I moved to Arizona back in the 80s and have been there ever since. Yeah.
Well, you definitely have your audience is growing quite quickly because of the way that you are attacking every single topic out there and just really trying to find out where we're headed and what the end goals are, which I find really interesting. And one thing that's popped up recently is this immigration issue that I talked about in the beginning. Is it just an effort to remove our borders? Is that what they're trying to do there?
Well, this is a worldwide movement. I mean, Europe has it a lot worse than we do. France and particularly Sweden have stopped being countries. They are basically just depositories for anybody that wants to come in from anywhere in the world, mostly Muslims. In America, we're a little bit behind the Europeans, but we're approaching that level. And immigration is designed to eradicate national borders. It's designed to basically disenfranchise our culture and basically make it a globalist culture without identity, and then take away our Constitution, our way of doing economics, which is primarily capitalism still. And it's a march towards a one world government and what they call the New World Order.
Yeah, and it seems to be we slowly starting to work towards this, because now, I mean, it feels like 10 years ago you would have never heard the idea that, oh, we should just have open borders. But now it's like the elites of the liberals especially are calling for, hey, catch and release, let's just put them back on the street.
Well, it's more than catch and release. It's facilitating criminal elements coming into this country. We actively have rogue elements that are tied to the deep state from organizations like the FBI, the State Department, DHS, that facilitate the entry of MS-13, ISIS, and other terrorist groups that mean us harm. We have imported an entire fifth column, and this is what Trump is attempting to stop.
Yeah, and it that brings us to a good topic of him trying to stand up against these elites and preserve what America actually is, this free sovereign nation. So let's say once they infiltrate all of America with these illegal immigrants, or dilute our culture so severely, what's the next step? What are we looking for that's coming up here in the maybe next 5 to 10 years?
Well, I don't know that we can project out that far. Mm-hmm. I don't know that we can even project beyond November. But what we're looking at happening right now is there was supposed to be a blue wave of the Democratic Party taking over Congress. And the Democratic Party has allowed themselves to become the minions of the deep state. And they're subversive. They're actually into insurrection right now, and we can get into that. But they were designed this fall to cause enough disruption in the country to cause them to get the majority in the House, hopefully the Senate, impeach Donald Trump, and then have their way in the 2020 election. And when that happens, we will become a total socialist, fascist nation with no constitutional liberties. The First Amendment will totally be gone. The Second Amendment will be gone. You'll have no due process. You notice the liberals, they only do what they want to do. They don't abide by the rule of law. And this is, well, let me back up. The blue wave, as they were calling it, which is the political takeover of the country, that's fizzled. It's crashed and burned. Tuesday's primaries showed that. Nancy Pelosi lost a couple of her top lieutenants. So now they have to go to Plan B, and Plan B has already been in effect for a couple of weeks. Maxine Waters basically inciting violence against Trump administration officials, White House officials. Maxine Waters assaulting Laura Loomer, and now she's responded. This reporter has responded with a lawsuit. We have no-go zones appearing in California. I'm now publishing, let's put it this way, I'm broadcasting a podcast that's going to air tomorrow morning that has pictures that are half German, half American, and it basically says Republicans not welcome. The German is to accentuate the fact that the Democrats are comparing the Republicans, because of their border policies, to be Nazis. Now, that's a flawed historical aspect, because the Nazis tried to keep people in. Trump is trying to keep people out. But these are appearing throughout Los Angeles right now, and I'm going to publish the pictures of this tomorrow. These are Republican no-go zones. And we see this in Paris with Muslim immigrants who basically have no French no-go zones. And you have a divided city in Paris that has seen a lot of terrorism, a lot of violence. And this is what's coming. This is the beginning of insurrection. This is the beginning of sedition. You see in Portland, for example, 1,500 protesters taking over the ICE building, taking down the American flag, putting up a flag that says refugees are welcome. That's a crime. But the biggest crime is the mayor of Portland, who's refusing to do anything about it and has told the police to stand down against these multiple felonies. That's insurrection. You have the mayor of Oakland that's been well publicized that she has advertised when ICE is going to make moves against immigrants for capture and deportation. That's a crime, interfering with a federal investigation and federal law enforcement. This is insurrection. This is where we're at. We're moving towards civil war.
Yeah, it definitely seems like the divide is getting greater and the tensions on both sides are rising. And so I'm trying to figure out what we can do to try and control this and try to taper things down a little bit and calm people out, so we can get back to just talking about the ideas and pushing us to just like a civil society again. And something that I ask myself is, we have Donald Trump, who has been doing largely a very good job with the policies that he's trying to put across, but he has a very harsh rhetoric that he incites. And do you think that's playing into the factor of this greater divide?
His demeanor is what it is. He's a street fighter. Mm-hmm. His demeanor is divisive, but it's not divisive along the lines of Maxine Waters,
right.
who's advocating for inciting riots and having violence against White House officials. So his divisiveness, his abruptness, his tone is confrontational, but it's not confrontational to the point where it's violent. And the Democrats can't make that claim. They have crossed the line multiple times. A lot of these organizations today pledged #resistance, Black Lives Matter, MoveOn.org, they're George Soros organizations. They're talking about disrupting America. Quite frankly, I thought this was all going to happen last summer, and I said it's going to happen. I was correct. I was just a year too early in my prognostication. If this gets carried out to its logical extreme, and you ask me how we restore the rule of law, I don't know that we can without violent confrontation. And I'm someone, I never advocate for violence, but I'm sitting back here looking, this is a realist. 75% of this country is conservative to various degrees. About 15% of the country doesn't have an identity system, a life system you can really identify. 10% are hardcore, what we would call deep state activists, whether they realize it or not, liberals who hate the Constitution, hate America. And ask yourself a question. If you were in a classroom and you had 10% of the students acting up and acting totally insane, would that class have order? And the answer is, of course, it wouldn't. And this is what we're looking at in America today. These people aren't going to accept election results. These people aren't going to follow the rule of law. They're going to do whatever they need to do to basically wrestle control of the country away from the conservatives. This is an all-out war declared by the liberals. And I believe Donald Trump, well, at some point, I think it's going to get so bad that he's going to have to declare martial law.
Ooh, what are your thoughts on that move by Trump if he was to move that martial law, especially when we come from a world that Obama used to be president and there was often threats of martial law that people were very concerned about. Would you support Trump in something like that?
It depends how bad it gets. If you have 5,000 people rioting, burning, looting, trying to kill, engaged in violence, these people need to be put away. You don't just simply let this go. And I think that was the fundamental mistake this country made in the 1992 LA riots, and I'm old enough to remember them, and I remember them clearly. And I was saying, where's justice? Where were the video cameras that would have captured a lot of this? Why aren't the authorities hunting down the perpetrators and putting them behind bars? And we did not. And as a consequence, I think we set the tone that you can do anything you want in the name of public protest if you're a liberal and get away with it. And we're going to see a lot of LA riots in this country. You see, if the Democrats fail in the election, and I think they already know they're going to, this is why we're seeing Maxine Waters, these other people rear their ugly heads, do the deeds they're doing. We are going to see an increasing volatility and polarization in this country. And I don't think there's any turning back from it. Now, let me step aside and say this. This is a battle between good and evil. This is a battle between Satan and God. And ultimately, God can do what he wants, but he's not going to reward a nation by restoring law and order, peace and tranquility that has murdered 60 million of its own babies. He's not going to bestow beneficence to a country who engages in child sex trafficking with virtual impunity, the pornography that we have. So if we, on the right, the conservative right, and a lot of us are Christians, if we hope to prevail in this conflict without massive conflict, violence, and loss of life, we need to get on our knees, ask for forgiveness, and pledge to follow God's will. Follow the teachings in the Bible. Then I believe God will come in and he'll intervene and restore sanity to this country. I won't even place the odds on that because I won't underestimate the power of God. But if we were just looking at this in a three-dimensional plane, non-spiritual, the odds of having order restored in this country are slim and none.
It's definitely ramping up like we've talked about, and it gets harder and harder to see a way out. But I think what you said was so spot on with the fact that we need to step back and we need to repent. We really need to draw back to God. And I think we're seeing that in a lot of areas. We're seeing the separation of the crazy the crazy liberal or even extremely far right groups are starting to separate themselves, and people are starting to understand that they're insane and we don't want to follow them, and the majority of the population is starting to wake up, and we can see that with the growth of the alternative media quite largely. So yeah, I guess I'm hopeful that we're able to turn it around. So yeah, I guess I'm just more hopeful. But there's definitely a lot to be concerned about. And you mentioned Laura Loomer a little bit ago, and I have some concerns about that lawsuits that she's putting forward, because I saw the video, and from what I saw, the Maxine Walters was just kind of pushed her camera away and put some papers up in front and maybe hit her hand lightly. Do you think that because it's such a soft interaction that maybe discredits the conservative movement a little bit?
Let me ask you a question. What do you think the liberal Democrats would do if that were Donald Trump?
No, yeah, I understand that they would definitely pursue him, but does two wrongs make a right?
Well, I don't know that it's a matter of two wrongs. Does her level rise to the level of criminality in terms of her behavior? She's guilty of battery. I don't know if she's guilty of assault. I probably would not convict on that if I were in a jury, but I would convict her of battery. But she is a U.S. Congresswoman who the day before, or in that same time frame, I should say, has advocated for violence against White House officials. Mm-hmm. You can't consider this action with Laura Loomer in isolation. You have to look at the overall theme of her actions. And she's an abject criminal. She lives in the richest house in her district, $5 million worth in terms of the value. She makes $170,000 a year. Where did she get the money to buy that house? I mean, she is an abject criminal who's been outside the law for a very long time. And I quite frankly have just looked at her as a nuisance until recently, because I believe the switch has been flipped and the Democrats are engaged in Plan B. Since they know they're not going to win elections and gain control of the House and Senate, I believe they're engaged now in insurrection. And Maxine Waters is at the heart of this. She is at the tip of the spear, and I think she should be dealt with legally. And I think she should be charged with battery, and I think she should receive a sanction. I also think that her behavior is not worthy of someone in Congress. She should be censored. And I will tell you this, if I were a Democrat running for election right now, I would distance myself from this woman as far as I could, and I would hope that she would be impeached, so at least the Democrats would have the appearance of following the rule of law. Mm-hmm. But it's not just Waters. It's across the board. We're going to see this ramp up and heat up. And I gave you 3 or 4 examples, the no-go zones and so forth. This is just the beginning. Let me back up here and I'll say this. I have training in disaster planning as part of my undergraduate degree in sociology. I have training as a result of my master's and PhD work in psychology. And when I combine the two together, what I see is an escalating level of social interaction that's going to turn violent, and it's going to turn violent fairly quickly. And I believe some of it is state-sponsored, rogue elements within our government. Let me just give you an example. I have a friend who works in the State Department named Monica Wesolowski. In the State Department, she works in graphics. The entire graphics department, still illegally, and it's illegal, they have Obama's picture up in her office. They have Obama's picture on their cubicles, and they charged her with violating the Hatch Act, which is federal officials endorsing some kind of political position, especially in an election. She has a picture of Donald Trump on her cubicle. He's the president. That's her boss. Mm-hmm. She's allowed to do that, but they tried to charge her with violating the Hatch Act. That's how crazy our government is. It's divided. We have Obama appointees who make up the deep state that are undermining him at every step. They try to crush conservatives whenever they can. The State Department is a total rogue organization, and I don't care who Obama appoints to be the head of it. They literally would have to fire 80 to 90% of the State Department to clean it out. The FBI is not much different, and I have FBI contacts who go back 30 years in their employment, and they are very concerned concerned about how they've been compromised. The CIA has never been for America. They're their own rogue organization that follows their own rules. They don't care about the U.S. They care about the affiliations they have, and a lot of it's international organized crime. So we go down all our agencies. This is why Trump can't get a lot done, because this deep state is massive. And this deep state is now going to provoke violence in this country as a way to disrupt this administration.
Yeah, you made some really good points there, especially going back to my original question on Laura Loomer and pulling the whole thing in context. I hadn't thought about it that way, so I think that's a very good point. And so as we kind of fast forward to what's coming up, especially in November, and say they're able to incite this civil war, essentially, because I actually read on the news that there's like 59% of the people think that a civil war is possible in the United States now, just because of how intense things are getting. So say they incite that. What's their move after that? When everyone's fighting and trying to kill each other, what's the New World Order move after that?
Well, you have to go back and you have to look at things like rules for radicals, Saul Alinsky. And what they say. And by the way, Hillary Clinton did her master's thesis on Saul Alinsky.
Yeah.
And they have a close association. I mean, his beliefs about how to disrupt. In fact, let me back up and I'll tell you, I had a conversation with a Democrat staffer of Raul Grijalva here in Arizona. And this man never met a border that he liked. And he's out of Tucson. And I was talking to the staffer, and I said, look, I'd like to get him on because I'd like to talk to him. No, you'll crucify him, and you're more articulate than he is, and you'll destroy him. And I said, look, if you listen to my show, I don't treat my guests that way. I let them have their say, then we do point counterpoint. I said, it's totally respectful. And then the staffer said to me, Dave, he said, I believe you. I believe you'll treat people fairly, but that's not the point. The point is we're not getting what we want. And our job now is to disrupt. It's not about issues. So I had a staffer of a congressman told me this. And this really underlies what the Democrats can do. It's kind of like the 2-year-old. They don't get their way, so they have a tantrum, and everyone else has to stand still and pay attention to it. That's what the Democrats are doing right now. It's a temper tantrum. And they're going to do it until this country falls apart. And what's the saying of the New World Order? Out of chaos comes order. So they can't bring down the country legally. They're going to bring it down through subterfuge and violence.
Yeah, just like when Obama replaced, I believe he replaced the eagle in the Oval Office with a phoenix. I think that's what it was. But just trying to raise something new out of the ashes and cleansing things with fire. I definitely see an effort with that. Even ramping up it seems like each summer has been getting more and more violent. There's been more shootings and more things like that. So what can we do about it? What can we do to bring us back? What are the steps? Do we have any? What are our moves? We know what the New World Order's moves are going to be. So what are our counter moves?
Well, I think some of the Hollywood types that are now coming out that are conservative, like James Woods, he said, arm up and vote. He said Democrats are becoming so unhinged, so out of control, motivated by deep state control, that no one is going to be safe. And when you have Steven Scalise a year ago that was almost murdered in a scenario that was not believable, he was after child sex trafficking when he was the only one shot in that baseball game. That was no accident. And so we've already had an attack on Steven Scalise. I believe what happened to Katie Arrington, who's running for Congress, and she was the shoe-in to win after she upset the incumbent, who was a never-Trumper as a Republican. She had a head-on accident that's unexplainable. The conditions don't match a natural accident, and I suspect it was the Boston brakes, which is the electronic takeover of a car. And the person that was operating that car was an elderly person, which makes them an ideal candidate to take over their car. And yes, the Boston brakes phenomena is a real deal. In fact, there's been many articles written about this. I think we have seen 2 attempted assassinations of political figures. So we need to define the territory before we define what our options are. Number one, I think people would be a fool to wear Make America Great Again hats out in public. You're inviting action against you. You're inviting actions against you when you speak out publicly outside of a formal forum. And even in a formal forum, you run the risk of having problems. So people need to be aware of their circumstances, their surroundings, and they need to take defensive actions. I do here with what we do. And I won't discuss them, because if I discuss them, people will know how to circumvent them. But in terms of what else people can do, well, if it gets bad enough, there'll be a total disruption of services. And I tell people routinely, food, water, guns, gold, ammo, and medicine. If we go into a social chaotic breakdown where the just-in-time deliveries aren't making the grocery deliveries to your stores, and they come 3 to 6 times a day, if that gets disrupted, you need to be prepared to go on your own. If you're in an urban environment, the people who haven't prepped will form gangs, or will already be in gangs and be going door to door. You better have alliances. And I hate to say it, but you better be armed, because they will be. And this is when we talk about the total breakdown. Now, I don't know that it'll happen across the country, but I am expecting that the blue wave, because it's evaporated, I think we are going to see mass violence in urban areas. We're going to see riots, and people in these areas are going to need to be able to take care of themselves. And if they have the food and water there, they don't have to venture out. Now, FEMA tells us the average person has less than 3 days of supplies. So that kind of defines the problem. So people need to be prepped. And I'll say it again, food, water, you need a Berkey water filter. I don't sell them. I don't represent one. I know Bob Griswold over at ReadyMadeResources.com does, but there'll be water around. The question is, will it be drinkable? Well, if you have a Berkey water filter, it will be. You probably should have some gold, because if this goes on long enough, your soon-to-be worthless cash isn't going to help you. As the economy would crash, so you would want precious metals, and you come out the other side smelling good. Although this is really the least of your concerns. You want to get through the initial part of the crisis, which will usually be about 30 days. Most crises burn themselves out in about a month. And then you look at the fact that you need guns and ammo, and you better train up and arm up. And I've never been one to say that in the past, but I think we're coming to that point. You remember, I've been doing this work now since 2003, when McCain first set upon us. And I have never advocated for people to arm up, but it's time, just for defensive purposes. And every legal code, the Bible recognizes self-defense. I'm not saying be aggressive. I'm saying run away from a fight if you can avoid it. At all costs, run away. But if you're cornered, and it comes down to you and your family versus some marauder coming into your home, you have a right to defend yourself. So then we look at some of the other essentials. If you've got people with chronic health conditions, a month without medicine could be catastrophic for them. This is why I've taken up the study of natural health care. And my favorite guy is Ted Broer at healthmasters.com, because he helps me out all the time. And I go to him before I go to my doctor. But you're not going to be able to stockpile prescriptions. That's prohibited by law. It'd be very difficult to do. But you can stockpile the equivalent from natural health care. And I tell people that you need to basically take those steps. But one of the biggest things you need to do, you can't even put a price tag on it. If you're in an urban, suburban area, you better know your neighbors. I hope your fences are down below eye level, because you need to engage your neighbors, because you can't defend your property yourself by yourself. You better have alliances. So when we look at that situation, you've got to know your neighbors. You've got to engage them. And I think now, if you would have said this 10 years ago to your average neighbor, hey, we're really in trouble here, and I got your back if you got mine, they would tell you to go see a psychologist and take some medication. Today, I think there's enough awareness among most of the people in this country that they recognize that we are on the edge of a social and political breakdown in this country. And I think that they would engage you in those conversations as long as it wasn't too overbearing. And I always say, tread lightly, but try to reach out and get that support from people you know. Now, I'm lucky. In my neighborhood, we took on John McCain and beat him. And my neighbors all know me. In fact, many of them listen to my show, and they read my website at thecommonsenseshow.com. But most people aren't as lucky as I am. And I'm just saying, you need to develop those alliances, need to do it now. And when holy heck hits the fan, you may not be able to get to your brother's house. You may not be able to get to your parents' house. You might be isolated right where you're at. You probably weren't expecting me to talk this way when you got a hold of me, but I'm looking ahead. If the Democrats can't win in November, how far, on behalf of the deep state that controls their party, how far are they willing to go? And let me just tell you how serious it is with the Democrats. There's a gentleman named Trevor Loudon, and he wrote a work called Enemies Within, and they made it into a video that you can see on Amazon Prime. I think the cost is like about $4.95. Trevor documented what Cynthia McKinney, former congresswoman, Robert David Steele, former clandestine CIA officer, now a friend of mine, I have him on my show a lot, and also Alan West, who I've spoken to. These three people have said the same thing as Trevor Loudon has found. There are at least 80 Democratic people in Congress. Now, maybe less now because Al Franken got shown the door because of his sexual improprieties. But people like that, Nancy Pelosi, Elizabeth Warren, I could go off and name all the prominent Democrats. They belong to front groups for either the Muslim Brotherhood or front groups for the American Communist Party. And Trevor Loudon has the documentation. He has it nailed. Alan West was driven from office for saying it, as was Cynthia McKinney, but they were right on the money. And here comes a former CIA clandestine officer, Robert David Steele, that says, hey, they're all right. This is exactly what is infested the Democratic Party today. They are about socialism, fascism, and not the rule of law the way we understand it.
Yeah, you definitely see that with the fact that Bernie Sanders can get close enough to winning, speaks so much about the plans for the Democratic Party in regards to communism and socialism. One thing that you said I guess I have a question on is you said that probably the majority of your neighbors are awake and know what's going on, and even earlier said maybe 75% of the people have a conservative mindset. Don't you think that's enough of the majority to squash any huge violent uprising?
No. I just had this discussion with Robert David Steele of the CIA just yesterday. There's a big difference between awareness and action. Someone else will do it. Donald Trump's the president. We can go back to sleep now. Everything is okay. He'll fix whatever problem comes our way. And what I see now is total withdrawal from activity. I mean, when we had the lead up to the election, had the deep state made their move on America then, let's say they had assassinated Trump and they had attempted a military coup of some sort on the government, the people would have acted. They were whipped up into a frenzy enough at that time, it would have happened. But since the election of Trump and the fact that more people are going to work, manufacturers being restored to the country, Trump is kicking butt on foreign trade imbalances. He's going against the free trade agreements, which he promised to do. He's trying to shut down the border. The people are saying, hey, everything's okay. We don't have to worry. And that's not the case. And I will tell you that, well, let me back up and tell you how fragile the Trump myth is. He is under assassination watch. And this is no secret. Anyone who's involved in any kind of deep level of the government will tell you this. He doesn't rely on the Secret Service for his protection. He relies on the Marine Corps. The Secret Service does perfunctory, superficial surface duties and really very little more. He only trusts the Marine Corps, and it's for a good reason. He understands what I already know, that the Secret Service was complicit in compromising the protection for John Kennedy in 1963. The same thing happened to Ronald Reagan right after he was elected. He knows his history, and this is why he's taken the steps. Excuse me, but if Trump were to be assassinated, if Trump were to be assassinated, this country would go into such chaos. I don't think organized efforts would save the day. I think we would go into instant chaos and civil war. And let me give you one more variable. We should talk about California. The liberals have control of something called the Calexit movement. It's the brainchild of George Soros and Governor Jerry Brown. But you have the drug cartels involved, and I don't really have time to fully develop how I know all that I'm going to say. We've discussed it in interviews I've done with Paul Preston of the New California Movement, and I've been writing about this now for about a year and a half. But the Bank of China is involved, the Mexican consulate's involved, former members of the Obama administration. Eric Holder is the spokesperson for a group called CalExit, which is the leaving of the United States by California. They even opened an embassy in Russia, and I don't know what's happened to it in the year since I did the story, but I had the pictures of the banner, the rollout of the press conference. I published those pictures. And CalExit is designed to take California out of the Union and have it be a protectorate of the United Nations. Now, the CalExit movement's in big trouble. It's been exposed for the fraud that it is. And so now there are three competing movements in California for control. One is the three-state plan, which is devised by a guy named Draper. His father owns Wikipedia, and he's a diehard globalist to the hilt, a Satanist as well. And this three-step approach would divide California up in such a way and gerrymander the political districts where the liberal Democrats will absolutely maintain control. The other plan is the New California plan, which is not going to be on the ballot. They're simply going through an administrative, legal, constitutional process to withdraw from the country, and they're going to basically leave everything from not San Diego, but L.A., up past the Bay Area, across to Sacramento, and I believe it's 44 out of 58 counties are going conservative, and they're going to be the New California. And the leader of that movement's a friend of mine, Paul Preston of Agenda 21 Radio. That is going to be what prevails in California at the end of the day. So let's talk about what this means. The meetings that have been held with CalExit have been attended by people from La Raza, the Sinaloa drug cartels, organized crime families from China, the Chinese military in the form of Sinta, which is a front group where they run our solar energy farms in much of the West, but they're really a military group getting a foothold in this country. But we need to talk about the Kigali principles. If these subversive groups behind CalExit are able to stir up enough chaos, and this is now the perfect environment for this to happen. Obama signed something before he left office called the Kigali Principles, and that's based on Kigali, Rwanda, where they had the massacre of 1 million people in 90 days. The Kigali Principles say this: if 29 nations agree, and the 29 nations by treaty under the UN, that there's chaos in a country, they don't need permission from the existing government. They can roll their troops into that area and create martial law situation and take whatever military action they deem necessary. I believe that what the Democrats are headed towards here, what the deep state will do, since they can't win politically, this is what they're going to invoke. Now, if you go back and if you go to my website and you not Google, but do the search engine on my website, and you put in Kigali principles, get ready to read a lot of articles. I've detailed it to a fine point. I also have detailed the presence of the UN in this country. I've got pictures, I've got videos, I've got firsthand testimonies, and I've also detailed the presence of foreign troops in our country that are part of the Kigali principles, including Russian and Chinese soldiers that are embedded. And most importantly, in 2011, I published on our website an agreement between the defense foreign minister of Russia and Obama's FEMA, controlled FEMA, as well as DHS, to bring in the first 15,000 Russian soldiers to assist with disaster planning. We don't need disaster assistance from the Russian military. That was a ruse designed to get them here. So when the Kigali principles are invoked, those are your troops that will immediately spring into action, and they'll go to battle. And they're embedded right now in places like northern Colorado, and we've got lots of proof. We've published it on my website. Gatlinburg, Tennessee, northern California, Alaska. They're fully throughout the country. The evidence is overwhelming. And there's many in the independent media who have joined me in presenting that proof. The Kigali principles, I believe, is where we are probably going to head. Now, that'll leave the U.S. military in a quandary. Most of the military, according to all the research, will stay loyal to the people. They'll stay loyal to the Constitution, and they will defend the people. The civil war that will be coming won't be between myself and some Democrat breaking into my house. The real civil war will be between the military forces of the United Nations versus those military forces in our country that remain loyal to the government and the people. That's where this is ultimately headed. The documentation for this is voluminous.
Wouldn't Trump know about this? Wouldn't he be working to remove these types of things?
He can't. He can't remove it. You see, Obama gave the UN permission. They simply have to decide we're coming in and they're going in. This is why why Trump wants to shut down the border. You know, when he sent the military to the border, he didn't send them there to stop 1,500 migrants. That was a total overreaction for that kind of an event. What's behind the 1,500 migrants is where they came from. And a lot of them came from Central America, not Mexico. And what's in places like El Salvador? Terrorist-based training camps where we've seen the marriage between ISIS, the Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas, Hezbollah, the Sinaloas, the Juarez, the Sanchez Paredes drug cartel out of Peru, which is basically the Peruvian army. They have all coalesced. I've interviewed witnesses who've been there and have seen it. I've interviewed people from the CIA who are sickened by it, and they will talk to me off the record and have led me to open source intelligence on the internet to verify this. And this is what Trump's afraid of. This is the Red Dawn invasion force. Mm-hmm. And this is why Trump militarized the border and why we have permanent military now on the border, because he knows that a Red Dawn invasion is very possible.
What did I say in the beginning, guys? I told you we cover a broad spectrum of topics, and we brought it right full circle back to the immigration topic. So, a lot of things that you have to keep an eye out for. Definitely go and do your research on what Dave just talked about, because if you don't know about these things, you're not going to be able to understand what's coming and the news what's coming. So we got about 5 or so minutes left. Was there anything that we didn't get to touch on that you really think is important that people need to know about?
Well, I think that we're seeing the emergence of FEMA camps in the news now. And I popularized FEMA camps. I'm writing a book on it right now. Should be done by the end of the summer. But with FEMA camps now, what we're seeing, and I wrote about this in 2015, when the Walmart FEMA camps, I should say Walmart shut down for plumbing reasons, we knew that was bogus. I published pictures of construction outside the plumbing, and they said it was for plumbing. I've got security contractors that were associated with the CIA, basically called Central Security. I published their pictures of their vehicles, gave the bio of their companies. They work for DHS as well. But they were basically doing was converting selected Walmarts into FEMA camps. They also put tunnels into them, and I wrote a series of articles over a period of about 3 months, mostly spring and summer of 2015, and people can look that up on my website. And most of my information came from people that went out and scouted these Walmarts locally for me and sent me pictures. And so what we're seeing now is the emergence of FEMA camps, and we see it at the border. Brownsville, Texas, the holding of migrant children without their parents in a FEMA camp facility. We've had congressmen go to that camp. They can't get in. DHS turns them away. I have an inside report who told me 4 FBI officials went there to investigate child sex trafficking being facilitated out of that particular place. They were refused admittance. And the intel they were acting on said the people who are basically running the child sex trafficking are those groups I just mentioned from San Salvador with the terrorist-based training camps. And this is in part how they finance their operations. There is a war right now for control of the FEMA camps. I believe Donald Trump, and I'm not alone in this belief, the idea was put in my head by a member of the CIA. I believe Donald Trump is basically thinking he's going to need FEMA camps to deal with the radical left when they go totally violent. And the left wants control of the FEMA camps, and they're using the rogue elements of DHS to do this, because if they win and gain control of the government, it's people like you and me that are going to be going to those camps. So keep your eye on the FEMA camp issue, because it's kind of the barometer of what's going on.
Yeah, absolutely. keep your eyes open, guys. You got to know what's going on for sure. Mr. Hodges, thank you so much for coming on the show. Where can people find you? How can they support you? And what do you have coming up?
Well, I appreciate you asking that. We have a radio show that airs every Sunday evening, and we replay it on our website. You also can access it through the website. If you're lucky enough to be near a radio station that carries it, well, you listen to it there. But it's Sunday nights from 8 to 11 Eastern, 5 to 8 Pacific. Also, I put out 9 YouTube videos per day on various topics by the same name, The Common Sense Show. And we also have a website, thecommonsenseshow.com. And I would recommend people said, hey, Dave, I've never heard of some of these things you talked about today. Okay, go back and listen to this broadcast, jot down a few notes, and go to the search engine on my website, and you will find everything I talked about with lots of documentation.
Absolutely. It's so important to at least look into it. Maybe you're sitting here questioning, like, I don't know if I could buy that. Well, good. Don't just believe it. Go and do your research and then see if it checks out. I think that's what we're all supposed to do. Mr. Hodges, thank you so much for coming on the show. I appreciate it.
Hey, always a pleasure, Samuel. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Well, that's our show today, guys. We didn't talk about it a ton, but we did touch on it. We have a lot coming at us, and it's important that we figure out the truth. But ultimately, we must turn back to God. We must repent for what is going on in our country, and God will restore us. He will protect us if we can repent and follow His will and do what He wants. That's what the message is always going to be, is trust in Jesus, and He'll take us through. But be prepared, be ready, know what's going on, because if you're not, you're going to get caught up in Satan's trap, and you're going to be in trouble. But God will protect us. Remember, what Satan intends for evil, God intends for good, so that the multitudes will be saved. Genesis 50:20. That's our message. Guys, I'm not going to ask you to like, subscribe, or share, but I appreciate it if you do. I hope you enjoyed the show, and I hope that you have a great week.